The billionaire's blind spot. He ruined her life. 5 years later, she was his only regret. Subscribe now, like this video, and comment your thoughts below. If you've ever felt like your past mistakes were too big to fix, this story is for you. Part 1. The Iceberg and the Flame. The air in the penthouse office high above Manhattan was thick with the scent of ambition and expensive leather. The city lights blazed against the glass walls, but the only illumination Alexander Vance cared about came from the digital screens showing his net worth. He was a force of nature, CEO of Vanguard Industries, a man forged by sheer, uncompromising discipline. Everything he possessed, the empire, the prestige, the unfathomable wealth, was the result of years spent demanding more and, crucially, feeling less. Emotion was for the weak, he'd told himself, for those who couldn't control their desires. He was the controller, the one who issued commands, not the one who surrendered to feeling. Yet, a fissure had begun to crack the armor, starting the moment Juliet Hayes entered his life. She was an unexpected calm in his manufactured storm. Juliet was the kind of woman who genuinely smiled at strangers and looked at people as if she saw the depth beneath their perfectly curated surfaces. Initially, she was just another name on his payroll, a brilliant marketing executive, until she became something else. There was a disarming grace in her presence, a way she challenged him without fear, without pretense. For a man obsessed with order, she was chaos draped in silk. It started subtly, her light laughter echoing down the hall after a late meeting, the way she could effortlessly dismantle his arguments during a board discussion, the feeling that his normally cold, sterile office softened whenever she was there. He rationalized it, calling it a temporary distraction, a passing whim. It wasn't. She became the one person who could quiet his racing mind, who made him put down his phone and forget about stock numbers and deadlines. Then she told him she loved him. Alexander didn't know what to do with that. He didn't believe in love. It wasn't logical, it wasn't measurable, and it certainly wasn't secure. He tried to tell her this once, but the words caught in his throat like a confession he wasn't prepared to make. So, he did what he always did when something terrified him. He buried it. When she told him she was pregnant, it felt like the floor had disintegrated beneath him. His mind was instantly flooded with questions, all practical, none emotional. The sensation wasn't joy. It was a raw, clawing panic that tore at the edges of his control. He remembered sitting behind his desk, staring at the numbers on the screen, only half hearing her voice tremble. "I'm going to keep the baby." He didn't move. He just looked at her, cold and silent, his mind already spinning with the implications. His reputation, the media, the complications. "You'll have the child, and you will regret it," he finally said, his voice so quiet it sounded mechanical. Her eyes widened, the pain flashing like lightning, but he didn't stop. "I don't want any part of this. Don't call me again." He walked out. He didn't look back, refused to let himself see her collapse. The elevator doors closed, and for a fleeting second, his chest tightened, but he immediately dismissed it as anger. He convinced himself she would get over it, that it was better to end things before they became a complete disaster. It was easier to believe that lie than to admit the terrifying truth. For the first time, someone had touched a part of him he couldn't control. That night, he poured a drink and stared out at the city, the view that always brought him comfort. It failed him. The lights seemed colder. The silence of the penthouse felt heavier. He kept hearing her voice in his head, soft and shaky, yet strong enough to linger. "You'll see, Alexander. One day, you will understand." He drank until the words dissolved into the hum of the city below. Meanwhile, Juliet sat alone in their shared apartment, her body shaking with silent sobs. Her mind reeled between disbelief and terror. She pressed a hand against her stomach, whispering that everything would be fine, that she didn't need him. A part of her wanted to hate him, but another part couldn't. Love doesn't always vanish when it's broken. It lingers like smoke, impossible to breathe, yet hard to forget. That night, she packed a single small bag and decided to leave the city. She couldn't stay surrounded by reminders of him. She left behind everything: the apartment, her job, the life that had revolved around him, and took the first train to a town she'd never even heard of. Interactive question. If you were Juliet, what would be the single most important thing you'd pack to start your new life? Tell me in the comments. Part 2. The quiet harbor and the living regret. The small coastal town of Port Blossom, Oregon, was nothing like the glass and steel world Juliet had fled. Here, mornings began with the scent of salt and baking bread, the cries of gulls, and the soft chatter of people who still took the time to greet one another. It took months to feel safe, to stop looking over her shoulder as if Alexander's voice might suddenly echo behind her. She found a tiny apartment above a local bakery, a place with peeling paint and mismatched furniture. But it was hers. She initially took a job helping the baker, spending her days kneading dough and her nights watching the ocean, hand resting on her growing belly. When Leo was born, the world shifted into color. She remembered the first time she held him, his small fingers curling around hers like a promise. His eyes, that same striking blue she could never forget, both hurt and healed her heart simultaneously. That was the moment she realized she didn't need Alexander, not his approval, not his money, not even his apology. All she needed was this child who looked at her as if she were his entire world. She named him Leo because it meant lion, and he became exactly that. A reason to keep living when everything else felt lost. The years that followed were tough, but they were her own. She learned to stretch every dollar, to fix what broke, and to stay up late finishing orders for the small, quaint cafe she opened on Harbor Street, called the Compass Rose. It wasn't much, but people came because she made them feel welcome. Leo grew fast. At 5 years old, he had a curious mind and a room-filling laugh. Sometimes, when he looked at her with those penetrating blue eyes, she'd see traces of the man she once loved, and that familiar ache would stir again. But there was no anger anymore, just a bittersweet acceptance. She had never spoken his father's name. Meanwhile, in Manhattan, Alexander plunged into work harder than ever. The more success he achieved, the less he felt. But every so often, when he saw a child with the same dark hair or heard a laugh that sounded like hers, his chest would constrict. He ignored it, buried it, and called it weakness. He didn't know that the life he had walked away from would one day return to find him, not as a memory, but as a living, breathing reminder of the man he once was, and the man he would have to become to earn forgiveness. Alexander had always believed in control, not coincidence. Everything in his life had been the result of careful calculation. Yet, when his company began scouting expansion locations, and the name Port Blossom appeared on the proposal, he felt a strange, unexplained flicker of hesitation. It was a strategically perfect market, but something in his chest tightened when he first said the town's name aloud. He didn't consciously recognize it, not yet. But deep down, it stirred a memory he had buried years ago. He approved the project instantly, convincing himself the unease was weakness. He arrived in Port Blossom on a rainy Tuesday. The simplicity of the town unsettled him. There were no skyscrapers, no frantic noise of ambition. The air smelled of sea salt and rain, and everything felt too quiet. For the first time in years, he didn't feel powerful here. He felt small. His assistant had booked him dinner at a local spot. He almost refused, but the silence of the hotel room became unbearable, so he went. He didn't know that this simple choice would change everything. The cafe, the Compass Rose, was smaller than he expected. It smelled of vanilla and coffee. He stepped inside, shaking rain from his tailored coat, and found a seat near the window. His attention was immediately drawn to a small boy at the back table. The child was drawing on a napkin with a red crayon, his tongue slightly sticking out in concentration. His hair was dark, his features delicate. And when the boy looked up, Alexander froze. Blue eyes, not just blue eyes, his blue eyes. His breath caught in his throat. His fingers clenched the coffee cup until the porcelain almost cracked. The boy turned away, oblivious. But Alexander's gaze was locked, unable to comprehend the sharp, unfamiliar ache in his chest. Then he heard a voice, soft, familiar, and achingly real. Juliet emerged from behind the counter, carrying a tray, her brown hair loosely tied back, her green eyes shining softly under the cafe lights. Juliet. The world tilted. For a moment, he thought it was a cruel trick of memory, that he had finally gone mad from too many sleepless nights. But she was real, standing right there. She didn't notice him at first. She walked past his table, smiling that same small, warm smile that had once disarmed him. When she finally looked up and their eyes met, the world paused. He saw the recognition hit her like a wave, the half-second where her body froze before she instantly composed herself. There was no anger on her face, no shock, just a cold, distant calm that hurt more than if she had screamed. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words tangled in his throat. She walked up to him, her voice even. "We're closing soon," she said, though there were still customers around. He nodded, numb, realizing she wanted him gone. He left without finishing his coffee, his heart pounding a rhythm he hadn't felt in years. He stood outside for a long time, staring through the window at her moving between the tables. The child was gone, but he couldn't get the image out of his mind. Those eyes. His eyes. He felt it deep within him, the quiet certainty that burned away all denial. The child was his son. Don't forget to like and share this video. Do you think Juliet should have kept his secret this long? Let me know. Part 3. The battle for forgiveness. Alexander didn't sleep that night. He tried to convince himself he was mistaken, that the resemblance was just a trick of guilt. But then he remembered her face. She hadn't looked surprised. It was the look of someone who had long ago accepted being hurt and moved past it. He drove aimlessly the next morning, drawn back to the cafe. When he finally arrived, it was closed. A handwritten sign in the window read, "Be back at 9:00 a.m." He stood there for a long time. For a man who had spent his life giving orders, he suddenly had no idea what to do. He spent the next day in mandatory meetings, but his mind was trapped in the moment he had looked into his son's eyes. The morning after, he forced himself inside. He had rehearsed a dozen things to say, all of them meaningless. She looked up from behind the counter, her expression neutral and guarded. "Coffee?" she asked, her tone polite, distant, as if he were just another customer. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. She served his drink without meeting his eyes and slid it across the counter. He sat there for an hour, pretending to look at his phone, but his attention never strayed from her. Then, the sound of a child's laughter erupted from the kitchen. Leo scampered out with a plate of cookies. Juliet smiled down at him with a tenderness Alexander hadn't seen in years. The boy looked at Alexander, curious but unafraid. "Hello," he said simply before running back into the kitchen. Alexander felt his throat close. He wanted to apologize, to explain, but nothing seemed enough. Juliet broke the silence. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice low. Still not looking at him, he stared at her, guilt and desperation interwoven. "Maybe not," he finally said, "but I had to see you." She shook her head, her voice trembling but controlled. "Why now, Alexander? After all this time?" "I don't know," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I just needed to." She laughed, not cruelly, but tiredly. "You needed to? You also needed to protect yourself the night you left, remember? And I needed to learn how to raise a son alone." She turned to wipe the counter, her hands shaking slightly. "Juliet," he said after a moment. "I didn't know what I was doing then. I thought—" She cut him off sharply. "You thought I was lying. You thought I was after your money. Don't rewrite it now." Her voice broke on the last word, and for the first time, he saw the raw pain he had caused, not as a distant memory, but as something alive and breathing in front of him. He wanted to tell her he had spent years regretting it, but he knew it wouldn't matter. Words couldn't undo what he had done. He nodded, backing away. "I'll go," he said quietly. "But I meant what I said. I just needed to see you." She didn't reply. As he reached the door, a small voice called out, "Wait." Leo was standing there, holding a napkin with a drawing. "You forgot your coffee," the boy said, smiling. Alexander took the napkin instead, his hands trembling slightly. It was a simple drawing, 3 stick figures holding hands, a sun above them. He didn't know why, but he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. "Thank you, buddy," he managed, his voice rough. Over the following weeks, Alexander became a quiet fixture in their lives. He helped fix a broken shelf in the cafe without being asked. He ran supply errands and even watched Leo when Juliet was too busy. He was no longer the imposing CEO. He was a humbled man, stripped of his armor. One afternoon, Leo was sitting at a table drawing while humming softly. Alexander watched him for a moment before rising. "Do you mind if I sit with him?" he asked, his tone cautious. Juliet hesitated, but Leo was already smiling and beckoning him over. "Fine," she sighed. "Just don't distract him." Alexander sat down, watching Leo proudly point to his drawing. A messy but vibrant picture of a man, a woman, and a child standing in front of the cafe. "That's me and Mom," Leo explained. "And that's our house." Alexander's throat closed as he looked at the drawing, his eyes following the empty space where another figure could have been. "It's beautiful," he said softly. "You're a great artist." Alexander stayed quiet for most of the afternoon, content to listen to Leo chatter about school and superheroes. When Leo went to the back to wash his hands, Alexander turned to Juliet. "He's incredible," he said, his voice low. "He's my whole world," she replied without looking up. He paused before responding. "He's mine too, even if I don't deserve to say it." That made her stop. She turned to look at him, her expression unreadable. "You don't deserve it," she said simply. But her voice had lost some of its edge. Juliet looked at him then. Really looked at him. There was no arrogance in his eyes, no pride, only love. Quiet and steady like a tide that never fails to return to the shore. "You know what?" she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I used to imagine what I would say if I ever saw you again. I thought I would scream or cry or tell you I hated you." Alexander looked at her with silent pain. "You would have been right to," she smiled faintly. "But when I saw you that day in the cafe, I didn't feel rage. I just felt tired. I thought I had buried every piece of you. I was wrong." She put down her mug and looked him in the eyes. "People change, Alexander. I see that now. But so do scars. They fade, but they leave marks." He nodded, his voice rough. "Then let me live with the marks. Let me earn my place in your life, even if it's just as Leo's father. That would be enough for me." She studied him for a long moment, and in that silence, An unspoken thing passed between them, a shared acknowledgement of everything they had survived. "You don't have to earn it anymore," she said softly. "You already have." His eyes widened slightly, as if he wasn't sure he had heard her correctly. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand. "I forgive you," she whispered. It wasn't dramatic, no tears, no trembling words, just the simple truth, spoken plainly. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, his breath catching, as if the weight of years had suddenly lifted. When he opened them again, there was a light there, something whole and unwoken. Part 4. The Compass Rose Conclusion. Weeks later, the summer sun hung low over Port Blossom, casting a golden light on the harbor. Juliet stood outside the cafe, hanging a small sign. "Closed for private event," as Leo ran circles around her, chasing bubbles. It was his 6th birthday. Alexander watched Leo blow out his candle, surrounded by the people who loved him, and felt a final, complete easing in his chest. He had missed the first years of his son's life, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could be part of the rest. That night, they sat together on the beach, Leo building a sandcastle near the water's edge. Alexander looked at Juliet, the wind stirring her hair, and said, "You were right, you know. Love isn't a weakness. It's the only thing that lasts." She turned to him, smiling faintly. "It always was. You just had to learn it the hard way." He chuckled, his eyes never leaving hers. "I think that was the only way I could have learned." She leaned against him then, not as a woman giving up, but as someone who was finally allowing herself to rest. As the waves rolled in and Leo's laughter filled the air, Alexander wrapped his arm around her. The man who once believed he had everything finally understood what it meant to have enough. The pain, the loss, the years apart, it had all led them here, to this moment where forgiveness had taken the shape of a family. Juliet knew life would never be perfect, but it didn't need to be. It was real. It was hers. And that was more than enough. Call to action. What do you think will be Alexander's first major mistake as a full-time father? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of second chances. Part 5. 2 Worlds and the Billion-Dollar Choice. Subscribe right now, like this video, and comment your thoughts on what Alexander should give up. Part 5. 2 Worlds and the Billion-Dollar Choice. Forgiveness had opened a path, but that path was not paved with roses. The relationship between Alexander and Juliet was now a delicate balance, a slow merger of 2 lives that had once been worlds apart. Alexander made good on his promise. He stayed in Port Blossom, Oregon. He moved his primary operational center there, designating a rustic, Seaview cottage as the new headquarters for Vanguard Industries, a shift that sent a minor tremor through the financial district of Manhattan. Running a multi-billion-dollar empire from a quiet coastal town produced moments of ridiculous juxtaposition. On one occasion, he was deep into a critical merger conference call when Leo burst into the room, wearing a makeshift pirate hat, demanding his help to find buried treasure in the garden. Alexander, who once never allowed interruptions, put the call on mute, solemnly helped his son with the search, and then returned to the call, stating calmly, "Apologies. An urgent geological matter." Juliet watched it all. She saw a completely new Alexander, a man who worried more about Leo's math scores than stock prices. He learned the proper way to load a dishwasher, though still fumbled, and never failed to make her a cup of Earl Grey tea every morning, a small ritual she didn't realize she craved. She recognized that he was rebuilding trust, not with grand words, but with quiet, consistent action. However, the old world still loomed large. Once, an unscheduled black helicopter landed in the town parking lot, delivering a crucial investment partner. The partner, clad in a $5,000 suit, stared at the wooden sign of the Compass Rose, and then at Alexander, who was wearing faded jeans and a smudge of flour, with utter disbelief. The pressure began to weigh on Alexander. He still had to fly to Europe or Asia for a week at a time to close deals that simply couldn't be done remotely. Those absences, however brief, still left Juliet unsettled. One night, she woke up and found him standing by the window, staring out at the ocean, his phone glowing with dozens of unread emails. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Alexander sighed, rubbing his face. "I promised I wouldn't miss anything again," he said, his voice laced with exhaustion. "But my old world won't let go. They need me back in New York, full time." "And what do you want?" Juliet asked. He turned to her, his gaze sharp yet vulnerable. "I want to be here. I want to see Leo wake up to the sunrise. I want to smell your baking every morning. But I built all of that, and walking away from it feels like non-anesthetized surgery." Juliet moved closer, resting a hand on his arm. "I understand, but you can't live forever in this pull, Alexander. I'm not asking you to be poor, but I need you to be present. I need to know that when you're in New York, you won't forget how this place makes you feel." In that moment, Alexander knew he had to make a definitive choice, one that would shape their lives forever. He realized he had spent his entire life accumulating power, and now he had to use that power to refuse what no longer served his happiness. The next day, he arranged a virtual meeting with his entire executive board in New York. Leo, oblivious, was drawing a picture of his father, a man in a t-shirt holding an ice cream cone. When Juliet walked in, Alexander was ready. He was wearing a dress shirt, but the sleeves were rolled up. The light from the window highlighted the stark seriousness on his face. "Do you want to listen?" he asked. She shook her head. "I trust you." He smiled, a smile that was both heartfelt and courageous. He clicked the connection button. "Gentlemen," he began, his voice echoing across the wooden cottage. "This is a notice. I will be resigning as CEO of Vanguard." Juliet, standing just outside the doorway, sucked in a sharp breath. He continued, without a tremor. "I will be selling 90% of my stake. Vanguard will be run by a new CEO. I will retain a small investment fund, Leo and Juliet Ventures, focusing on sustainable startups. My work is done. My priorities have shifted." Chaos erupted over the computer speakers, but Alexander simply ended the call, not listening to the fallout. He turned around. Juliet was standing there, tears streaming down her face, yet she was smiling. You did it," she whispered. "You walked away from everything." He stepped to her, pulling her into an embrace, inhaling the familiar scent of her baking and sea salt. "I didn't walk away. I chose. I chose what you said was true. I chose the only thing that actually matters." Leo ran in, holding up his drawing. "Dad, it's you and me eating ice cream. Should I draw a dog too?" Alexander looked into his son's beaming face and hugged him tight. "Of course, Leo," he said. "We're going to draw a whole new life, right here." Interactive question. If you were running Vanguard, how long do you think Alexander will stay away? 1 year? 5 years? Or forever? Tell me in the comments. Call to action. Alexander and Juliet's story has reached an amazing turning point. Subscribe to the channel and like this video to catch. Part 6. Flour, the Sea, and New Currents. The financial world reeled from Alexander Vance's decision, calling it everything from a nervous breakdown to a sudden spiritual awakening. In Port Blossom, however, life simply shifted into a new, comfortable rhythm. The cottage by the sea became a home filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of fresh coffee, rather than the sterile silence of a Manhattan penthouse. Alexander now spent his mornings doing the school run with Leo, navigating parent-teacher conferences, and occasionally struggling with a clogged sink. He had traded boardrooms for baking sheets. His new office was a small, sunny table at the back of the Compass Rose, where he managed his boutique investment fund, Leo and Juliet Ventures, pouring his intellectual energy into sustainable technology and local development. But the biggest adjustment was the small, practical world of the cafe. One particularly busy Saturday, Juliet was overwhelmed. A large group of tourists had descended upon them, all demanding lattes and fresh pastries. Alexander, wearing an apron over his casual clothes, instinctively stepped behind the counter. "I'll take orders," he announced, with the crisp authority of a man leading a Fortune 500 company. He was fast, efficient, and precise, but lacked the gentle warmth that defined the Compass Rose. A local, Martha, a kind but notoriously slow-moving customer, approached the register. "Good morning, Alexander," she drawled. "I think I'll have my usual, a caramel macchiato, but with extra foam. And make sure it's not too hot, but not too cold. And can you use the almond milk from the blue carton? Not the red one." Alexander, who was used to dealing with multi-million-dollar negotiations, stared blankly. He opened his mouth to explain that they had only one type of almond milk. Juliet smoothly stepped in, placing a calming hand on his arm. "Morning, Martha," Juliet chirped. "I'll handle this one. Alexander, can you please take this stack of trays to the back and count the inventory?" Alexander, momentarily chastised, nodded. He was learning that the delicate art of customer service was far more complex than corporate strategy. Interactive question. If Alexander had to choose a new job in Port Blossom that didn't involve finance, what would he be best at? Fishing boat captain, high school economics teacher, or local mayor? Tell me your choice in the comments. His quiet, constant presence was the new foundation of their relationship. After closing the shop, they would sit together, watching the sunset, discussing their day. It wasn't about mergers or acquisitions. It was about the cafe's finances, Leo's latest obsession with space, or the leaky roof. One evening, Juliet confessed a long-held dream. "I want to expand the cafe," she said, looking out at the dark harbor. "There's a small property next door, an old bookstore. I could turn it into a dedicated bakery kitchen and a proper seating area. But I don't have the capital for the property acquisition and renovation." Alexander was instantly energized. This was a problem he understood. "I can fund it," he said immediately. "It would be an investment from Leo and Juliet Ventures. We can draft the business plan tomorrow." But Juliet hesitated. "No, Alexander, not like that. I don't want your money to be the foundation of this. I want us to build this together, truly together. I want to earn the loan, run the numbers, and prove the concept. We are partners now, not a rescue project." He looked at her, seeing the fierce independence that had allowed her to build this beautiful life alone. He smiled, his eyes full of respect. "You're right," he said. "Let's run the numbers. Let's make it a proper business pitch. You can start by presenting your initial proposal to the CEO of the fund." "Me." Juliet laughed, a genuine, joyful sound he loved more than any market bell. "Deal, Mr. Vance. I expect a formal prospectus on my desk tomorrow morning." The following weeks were a flurry of activity. They worked side by side late into the night. Alexander created sophisticated spreadsheets, while Juliet meticulously calculated the cost of new mixers and ovens. He respected her vision, and she welcomed his structural expertise. It was a partnership based on mutual purpose, a foundation stronger than any previous romantic whirlwind. Their greatest joy, however, was Leo. He was thriving with a present father. One afternoon, Alexander walked into the kitchen to find Leo sitting on the floor, holding a small toy airplane. "Dad," Leo asked, looking up with his striking blue eyes, "did you miss me when you were rich?" The question hit Alexander with the force of a physical blow. He crouched down, meeting his son's gaze, his heart aching with the honesty of a child. Leo, he said softly, pulling his son into a tight hug. When I was rich, I thought I had everything. But I was just living in a very cold, quiet house. I didn't know you existed, and that was the biggest hole in my life. Now that I've found you and your mom, I know the truth. I wasn't rich. I was just empty. I missed you before I even met you, buddy. Leo hugged him back, seemingly satisfied. Okay, now can you help me find my real plane? The one you gave me doesn't fly very high. Watching them, Juliet, who had been listening from the doorway, felt a final layer of ice melt away from her heart. The wounds were still there, but they had scarred cleanly. The man standing before her was truly and irrevocably changed. She stepped into the room, her hand brushing Alexander's shoulder. I think it's time we build something permanent, she whispered, a double meaning in her words that went far beyond the cafe expansion. Alexander looked at her, understanding the magnitude of her statement. He reached out, taking her hand and the hand of his son. The three of them stood in the warm kitchen, surrounded by the smell of yeast and hope. The sea breeze carried the distant rhythmic sound of the waves crashing against the shore, a constant reminder that even after the wildest storm, the tide always finds its way back home. Part 7. Breaking ground on love, opening the future. Juliet's words, I think it's time we build something permanent, had cast a powerful stillness over the kitchen. It wasn't just about expanding the cafe. It was her most profound invitation to Alexander to shape the future with her. The next morning, Alexander, director of the Leo and Juliet Ventures Fund, received a business plan. It was thick, meticulously detailed, and thoroughly professional, yet tied with a small red ribbon. Juliet had stayed up all night to complete it, translating her dream into tangible figures. She began her presentation, standing across from him in the living room. Alexander sat down, put on his glasses, and listened with absolute seriousness. Mr. Director, she began with a mischievous smile, the Compass Rose 2.0 project is more than just a bakery. It's a community hub, a stable supply for the town, and an opportunity to double revenue in 3 years. I've calculated the cost of remodeling, equipment purchase, and working capital. I require a loan of $450,000. The interest rate, we can negotiate later. Alexander flipped through the pages, impressed not just by the diligence, but by the blazing passion in every line. This was not a woman who needed rescuing. This was a partner. He closed the plan, pushing his glasses up. The proposal is very convincing, Juliet. However, I note a significant risk that has been critically underestimated. Juliet's heart sank. And what is that, sir? He stood up, walked around the table, and took her hands. He looked deeply into her eyes, his gaze no longer that of a cold CEO, but of a man who had found his sanctuary. That risk, he whispered, his voice low and warm, is that if we expand the business without a stronger legal and personal foundation, I won't be able to fully invest my life in you and Leo. He knelt down. There was no velvet box and no billion-dollar diamond. He had sold all of those. Instead, he pulled out an old polished key, engraved with the numbers 101B, the key to the old bookstore next door that she wanted to buy. Will you marry me, Juliet? He asked. Join me, not in building an empire, but in building a home, an enduring family. Help me turn this key into the key to our future. Will you embark on this permanent project with me? Juliet was speechless. Tears welled up. She realized that this moment, with the rustic key and the heartfelt promise, was worth more than $1 billion. Yes, Alexander, she choked out. Absolutely, yes. He slipped the key onto a delicate silver chain and placed it in her hand. They embraced, the moment serving as the final, absolute close to their decade-long separation. Interactive question. If Alexander could invite only one person from New York to the wedding, who should it be? The partner who arrived by helicopter, or Vanguard's former head of press? Comment your choice now. 2 weeks later, the signing of the old bookstore was complete. Alexander and Juliet were now co-owners of a new property, and the Compass Rose 2.0 officially began its renovation. While measuring the wall separating the old cafe from the new space, Alexander's phone rang. It was an unignorable New York number. David Chen, the new CEO of Vanguard. Alexander. David's voice was tense. I know you're in Oregon, but a major partner wants to buy up your entire beach area for a high-end resort development. They know you are the only one who can influence the town. They are willing to pay you a massive fee to fly back, just to broker this one deal. Alexander looked out the window, where Leo was diligently building a sandcastle. Juliet standing by his side, her face radiant. He turned back to the measuring tape in his hand. David, he said, his voice cold and final. I'm busy. I'm measuring to build a new bakery kitchen. Inform your partner, Port Blossom is not for sale, and I am no longer a man for negotiation. He hung up and smiled at Juliet. Done, he said. We need to knock down this wall first. Their new life had begun. It was no longer a story of money, power, or regret, but a story of flower, the sea, and love, built on a steady foundation. One day at a time. Call to action. Everything is set for a happy ending. Subscribe to the channel and like the video to write the most romantic and meaningful final chapter for Alexander and Juliet. Part 8. The Tide Comes Home. The construction of the Compass Rose 2.0 became a metaphor for the reconstruction of their lives. Alexander traded his expensive suits for overalls, working alongside local contractors. He found a strange fulfillment in the manual labor, in building something tangible and enduring, knowing that the foundation was strong. Juliet ran the old cafe, managed Leo, and meticulously supervised the budget, proving to Alexander every day that she was the best business partner he had ever had. Their wedding was everything Manhattan was not: small, genuine, and held right on the beach at sunset, 3 months after his proposal. Juliet wore a simple, elegant dress, and Alexander wore a linen suit. Their only guests were Leo, who served as the ring bearer and chief sandcastle architect, and a few close friends from Port Blossom, like Nora the florist and Ben the fisherman. When the minister asked for the rings, Leo stumbled slightly, clutching the small silver band. He recovered quickly, but as he stood between them, he looked up at Alexander, his eyes wide and earnest. Dad, Leo whispered loudly, interrupting the vows. Are you going to stay here forever now? Juliet held her breath. Alexander knelt, ignoring the quiet gasp from their small gathering. He took Leo's small hand and looked him straight in the eye, those piercing blue eyes he now cherished. Yes, buddy, Alexander said, his voice husky with emotion. I am home, and I am not going anywhere. I promise. Leo beamed, satisfied, and the ceremony continued. The moment perfectly encapsulated their journey. It was always about Leo's certainty, Juliet's trust, and Alexander's commitment. The opening of the Compass Rose 2.0 was a town event. It was sleek, warm, and bustling, with the new bakery kitchen churning out pastries that quickly became legendary. Alexander officially became the cafe's manager of operations and finance, proudly wearing a clean white apron. He still managed his investment fund from the corner table, but now his biggest daily challenge was making sure the almond milk supply was sufficient for Martha's specific, complex order. He had learned that true power wasn't about controlling vast markets. It was about the small moments, the weight of Juliet's hand in his, the scent of yeast and cinnamon, and the way Leo ran into his arms after school. One quiet afternoon, as Alexander was sweeping the floor, Juliet watched him from the counter. He looked up, catching her gaze. There was no need for grand declarations. The quiet, constant love that flowed between them was a result of years of pain, distance, and, finally, profound repentance. Alexander Vance had once believed he was destined to conquer the world. But standing in a small coastal town, sweeping flour from the floor of a cafe named for a navigation tool, he realized his destiny wasn't to conquer, but to find his way back to his true north, his family. He had walked away from a life of calculated perfection, only to find real, messy, unconditional love. He had traded endless zeros in a bank account for one simple, single truth. He was no longer empty. Juliet smiled, a radiant, whole smile. She had been left with nothing but a promise and a broken heart, but she had built an incredible life from those ruins. The man who had once ruined her life by leaving had, 5 years later, redeemed it by choosing to stay. Alexander walked over to her, wiping his hands on his apron. He leaned down and kissed her, a kiss that tasted like sea salt and second chances. "The tide always comes back, doesn't it?" he whispered. "Always," she confirmed. "But it only stays when you choose to build your house on the shore." Meaningful conclusion, the final lesson. This isn't a fairy tale where the billionaire simply fixes everything with his money. This is a story about the true cost of regret. Alexander didn't buy his way back. He earned it by trading his power for vulnerability, his control for trust, and his ambition for presence. The most valuable asset he owned wasn't Vanguard Industries. It was the moment he knelt down on the beach and promised his son he would stay. Remember this: sometimes the greatest success is the empire you choose to walk away from. To build a simple, meaningful home. Call to action. Thank you for being part of Alexander and Juliet's journey. Subscribe to the channel and like this video to celebrate the happy ending of the Compass Rose family. What story should we tell next? Let us know in the comments.